Wait, before the recording. So I was thinking about George Bataille, as that is what we're reading, and I rather liked his examination of biochemistry and energy. The sun is this thing that gives and gives and never takes, sort of like modus ponens. Isn't that right, Chase? Oh, you won't get that, YouTube. Haha. But in all seriousness, George Bataille, I understood the first part quite well because he's talking about simple organisms like the calf example and plants. But something really interesting happens when we talk to man and his expenditure or his excess. But what do we all think about his initial claim that when an organism cannot grow either by itself or in the species, the energy turns to luxury or one of these other outputs, right? Like he puts extension amongst them. Do we think that's true, that every organism has a limit to how much it can grow, both as an individual and its species? And so there must therefore be energy that is wasted. Is that fair to say that that's what the first part of this reading captures?
I mean, I spent a fair amount of time just struggling with what he meant by luxury. And I thought I actually found a phrase where he more or less defined it. Now I can't find that passage, but one sort of tentative definition was that something, when you have more energy than is required by mere maintenance of an organism or something like that. But then he also seemed to include growth. And so I'm not exactly sure what luxury is, but it sounds like something like when you've got an energy that exceeds the needs for maintenance of life and also growth. But at least I thought he said something like that. But that seems, maybe, I don't know, it's like that exceeds the growth that the environment is capable of or something. But I just don't have a real clear idea of exactly what he means by luxury. I mean, I have a vague sense, I just don't have a real clear sense. Yeah, it has something to do with excess energy, more energy than what?
I thought it was, my understanding was that luxury is anything beyond which the human organism doesn't need to sustain itself.
Didn't he say at one point that consumption of another species is the ultimate example of luxury and compared death to life, sustenance, and sex?
Yes, he did. And I think it might be best to paint the picture. So here on Earth, there is a finite amount of energy, which we first and foremost get from the sun, right? And then we have the amoeba and the most simple creatures who reproduce asexually. But for some reason, sexual reproduction becomes a thing, and organisms start eating each other, not only sustaining themselves on, what do you call it? The sun and energy just freely given. Anyway, Chase wanted to, didn't hear you, Joseph, so maybe you can reiterate your point.
And I'll find it in the text, I was wondering where he specifically was comparing luxury, the ultimate example of luxury being the consumption of one species by another, and then tied that into sexuality being outside of utility, like actually being an expression of energy of itself.
It's on page 33, the first sentence after the subheading, the three luxuries of nature, eating, death, and sexual reproduction. Last paragraph of page 33, first sentence.
Yeah, that's it. The eating of one species by another is the simplest form of luxury. I'm sorry, he called it the simplest form of luxury.
I mean, all three of those are forms of luxury. I think eating, death, and sexual reproduction. And I was wondering, what is the general notion of luxury in general? And I think it's, I still think it's something about, like he talks about utility, you know, like at the top of page 31, he says this is a question of acceptability, not utility. And so I think the luxury is something like having more energy than needed by utility. But then I'm not exactly sure what utility means. It's at the very, you know, at the very least, it's like the maintenance, the constant maintenance of an organization, of an organism, or of a community of organisms. But then again, I'm not finding it now, but he seemed to include growth under utility. So, you know, because at first I thought, well, maybe it's anything that is in excess of the maintenance, but it seems like he's saying no, growth is also part of utility.
I think
So I'm just not exactly sure where luxury fits in.
I think I can understand utility as in how Bataille gives it, because he gives the example of people wanting to see a bullfight, right? But all the seats are taken. And so what you can do is find other outlets for people to enjoy that. And so in the example of wealth, you know, energy, if in one environment, one species prevails, other species can use cunning ways to get in on the action, as he talks about with wings in the air, right? So for the animals that first existed, the simplest single-celled organisms, they all lived in water, eating whatever, right? And then when land became habitable, they lived there, but then some also went into the sky. And I think that's a lot of evolution and how interesting it works, right? Where if you can get food better through one, you know, set of genes rather than another, the one that gets the most food and is able to reproduce wins out. And so you have all of these methods of gaining food and energy, right? Eating other animals, insects, what have you. And that could all be considered utilitous. Is that even a word? Because it's going for the sake of growth, which Bataille seems to not include in luxury. But there seems to be a stopping point where you can no longer grow as an individual, right? And you cannot increase the population of your species. And I can only think of examples with people where you have luxury. I'm not sure, maybe this is a question for everybody. Can any animal delve into luxury, or is it only with people where you can do this industrial revolution, as he makes a point of in the 19th century, and therefore have the catastrophic result of the world wars?
I think luxury, I mean, I've been kind of hammering on this point, which could of course be completely wrong on Discord, but I think that luxury, like most of these concepts, is actually quite general. And so, you know, like I think, so I'm thinking luxury has something to do when growth, you know, because he talks about how life is always trying to fill space. And initially the space that it can fill is in the ocean, and then it fills space on the land, and then trees and flying things, life begins to fill, you know, the air. And so it's like life is always trying to fill the available volume, so that, you know, part of it has to do with literally volume of life and the volume that any particular environment can sustain. And so I'm thinking maybe luxury is when the growth reaches the point where the environment is no longer capable. You can't, so, you know, you can just keep expanding without limit. And at some point you hit the maximum, I don't know, volume of and density of living matter that this particular environment can sustain. And maybe that's where luxury begins, perhaps, because, you know, like I'm conditioned by this sort of classical model of economics where what happens is when you hit the limits of resources, things start dying, which I guess is true. But then, you know, that for him, that is a kind of luxury. It's because, you know, life expands so much that things have to start dying, and it just keeps expanding. And then in some environments, like I can't remember what he was talking about, like in jungles and stuff, if life can't expand in volume, it just starts getting crazy. And I keep seeing these kind of Nietzschean notions, you know, when Nietzsche talks about this wild growth that happens when there is when there's decadence, this kind of wild, and Nietzsche literally calls it jungle growth. And then he talks about how some people are representatives of this kind of jungle growth within human society, where they become so rich and so packed with I guess what Bataille would call luxury, and it happens almost within the human mind as well. And so, it's this sort of Dionysian, and I think pressure's in there too, because you could start generating all this pressure, but it's like life, if it can, and like think of jungles, it just keeps multiplying within that that environment. It gets denser and denser and denser. So luxury has something to do with that, like with reaching the sort of limits of, so maybe utility is you keep multiplying, you keep growing, you hit this limit, and then you just start getting this kind of wild, crazy growth, and you start getting death and these, because he says that part of it is when things start eating each other because you've got competition. But the classical model that I have a very vague sense of is the sort of Malthusian model, where death is a sign of some kind of failure of the environment to provide sufficient resources. And he seems to think of death as evidence of this wild luxury where you're packing so much organic material in a finite volume that just things start dying and eating each other, but it just keeps growing and keeps packing.
Yeah, his idea about luxury is definitely a strange, especially I'm not sure what the translation is exactly, but the way we would normally think of luxury is in a purely economic, almost cultural kind of way, which I want to say that that's probably intentional with the use of words he's using. He's trying to make a connection there with this economic factor, but also extended to a general principle, which is really connected with this, the whole as the movement of life. And so I think that part somewhat towards the end, sorry to go non-linear on y'all, but the contrast between the particular viewpoint and the general, that structure seems to be evident through a lot of the content of what he's talking about. So the that movement aspect of the vital aspect of life and whatnot that he's talking about as this general economy, that seems to be also this kind of super expansion of life's movement towards, which develops growth and all these other things, but also encounters these limits, and then those limits will cause it to work in different ways and have all this variety and whatnot. But you get the particular viewpoint kind of within the general, and from there you get those kind of classical economic perspectives and whatnot, which he's saying that's where we normally see these problems of scarcity and whatnot, or death and anguish. That's a lovely word. I wonder if it seems like, side note, that he's possibly talking somewhat about Kierkegaard in there. I think I get some kind of hints at that, but anyways, yeah. So luxury, though, I think is it's definitely that excess that of energy, I would say probably is the term he would want to use, and the way that it has to be naturally dissipated. And the idea is, what are you going to do with it? So I think even this our common way of thinking of the idea of luxury, like some rich person, what happens when, okay, you know, there's a way of thinking that would be, I think this is kind of what he'd mean by this kind of particular utilitarian idea, is it'd be something like, okay, I need resources in order to live. So you know, the society we live in, I need money, you know, bio-survival tickets, so I can buy all these resources that I can then, you know, accumulate and then consume them, I guess, and then live. But that's pretty easy to take care of in a lot of ways. Or that's actually kind of beside the point, although that is his point. But the thing is, what happens when you have that excess? When I no longer, I have enough money and food stocked in my cabinet, you know, I don't fear for starving to death at the moment, but I have this excess of food. Actually, I kind of have this problem right now, I just realized. Of, you know, the stuff in my refrigerator is going to go bad. Someone's got to eat it. Someone's got to do something with it. You know, I can throw it away. I just throw it outside. The fox will eat it. Maybe the deer, some of it, you know, insects, something. But, or I could eat it. You know, I don't need it. And I think that kind of, we're at the point where that decision is completely irrelevant to utilitarian means for the most part, although I can try to justify it on utilitarian grounds, like, oh, if I give it to the deer the cheese in my refrigerator, then I'll feel really good, and it's a really ethical thing to do, you know, because I mean I'm a teacher of ethics apparently, so that'll really help my identity formation, and I'll have a good life or whatever. Those are very secondary, arbitrary points of view of from the point of view of the particular individual. But that kind of general movement where there's excess and suddenly it exceeds also these utilitarian means by a kind of super saturation of all the resources that you would need to actually live and function and maintain yourself as a biological organism. So then you have this superseding sublation, dare I say, of the individual organism. And I think that's kind of what he means by luxury. And you can see it as just, okay, what happens when a rich person no longer needs all this food or whatever? What do they spend it on? They spend it on stupid shit that, what's the point? You know, it's not serving life generally on this purely, you know, biological level, in the sense of, I just need to eat food and, you know, that's it basically, just keep going. You know, that's usually what that particular point of view always gets around to. So that's what it seems like he's talking about with luxury, which is, it connects really with that main, the whole general economy as this movement of excess.
When I was trying to get a handle on him just in terms of his biography connected to history, and you know, in the early part of the books, he's only citing people from works published in the 1920s or 1950s, and this book was published after he died. He died at the age of 65. So I was trying to get a sense of this first 41 pages strikes me as a person that he was writing this before World War II. I don't know, there's just something about it that seems older in terms of his terms. And when I saw him talking about luxury, I didn't think of it at all as excess. I mean, well, it could be how we define excess, right? But if you have an excess of income over expenditure, well, then, you know, you might call that profit, right? But it seemed to me what he was saying, he was having a very practical definition of luxury. Basically, those things that you have that you literally don't need to sustain yourself biologically. Because if you separate the individual from the group, then sex isn't necessary if you think of it only in terms of reproduction, right? He made that distinction between when the individual's maturation, and that's when the individual's growth gets into the growth of the group. And I'm not sure if he used the word the group, might have used the word the community, but there was a hinge there, a link. And then he tied it to literally sexual maturity and then the ability to reproduce. And so if he's viewing, because remember, he says sex, death, and other things are luxuries. If he views sexual intercourse as a luxury, he has to be defining it to the individual human organism. And so literally for a person to survive, they don't need to have sex like they need to have water and food and a certain range of temperature.
I thought what he meant by sexuality, and you know, well, sure, human sexuality's got to be in there, but at least part of what he was talking about was, I think, was sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction. So that, you know, because he talked about how, you know, these first organisms just, I forgot the technical word he used, but they just clone themselves by splitting in two. But then when you get sexual reproduction, so, you know, in this asexual reproduction, you just get more individuals of the same kind, just a replication of you know, basically clones. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, it's a word with scission. I can't remember, but then when you get sexual reproduction, the offspring are different from either parent, and so you get a difference. You know, you start getting variations, and the individuals are no longer copies of the initial individual. And I think at least at the initial stage, that's kind of a luxury, you know, because you're no longer just splitting the individual and duplicating it. You're creating these new kinds of, you know, individual beings when you get sexual reproduction. I also wanted to make a comment about, and this may be just, you know, this typical problem of whatever you're reading seems to show up in other stuff. So in my class, which, you know, Eric will be familiar with this, we're in 1305, we're talking about the Republic. And I mentioned this, I think last time, but it just seems, I'm just wondering if Bataille is even maybe thinking about this, but when Socrates starts designing the natural human city, you know, that's supposed to represent, you know, a reflection of human nature, he initially designs the simple city, and the purpose of the simple city is simply to meet human needs. And it does that effectively. And he says you can meet human needs with the resources available to that particular community and additional resources that you can get with fair trade with other communities. So, you know, you've got your own resources and you're trading with other nations in this sort of peaceful economy, this trade economy. And you can meet people's needs that way because needs are finite. You know, each individual only needs a certain amount of food, a certain, you know, shelter and clothing and so on. And he says, and they can't have too much sex because if they have too much sex, the population is going to grow too much. So at least, you know, maybe it grows, but it grows to a place, it doesn't grow beyond the available resources. But then Glaucon complains that this would be a city fit for pigs because of the kind of food they eat. And so Socrates says, okay, well, let's design the city with a fever instead of the healthy city. And the city with the fever is explicitly the city that tries to satisfy people's desires in excess of their needs. And Socrates says, I'm not making a moral judgment here, but I'm telling you, this is where war starts. And so now we're going to have warriors, which is where you get the guardians and so on. But he seems to just concede, and for him, it's a concession. Maybe Bataille would say it shouldn't be thought that way, but it's a concession that human nature, for most of us, we will not be satisfied merely having our needs met. Most people are going to want to have desires met in excess of needs. And then, the point I make in class is once you start satisfying desires, unlike needs, which can be met with finite resources, desires expand indefinitely. It never stops. And so in the Republic, it seems to be absolutely inevitable that every community will expand beyond the available resources available to it and available through fair trade in this fair economy. It's inevitable because human beings are never going to be satisfied, that you're going to blow right past those available resources, and you're going to have to start taking shit from other cities, and they're going to do the same thing because everybody's going to be doing this. And so he says that's where you get war, is you get these cities consuming one another because they're all trying to satisfy these ever-growing desires. And that, at least, and I don't know what Bataille would say about that analysis, but it seems at least to have some relevance here in the sense that life wants to expand beyond. And Socrates would rather live in a simple city, but he basically concedes that it would be a minority of people who would be satisfied with that. And so, maybe Bataille would say, yeah, because that's what life does. Life just continually expands. It's not something to be sad about. It's just the way it is. Although then Bataille does seem to explicitly say, but we need to figure out something else to do with these excess resources besides killing one another. We need to figure out some other way to deal with these additional resources.
Yeah, I was going to address that last point because the way Socrates leaves it, right? If we just assume people are going to be pursuing desires, then it's inevitable, right? It will lead to war. Whereas Bataille seems to say, like, if we blindly follow our desires, then yes, it will lead to war. However, there is a hope that we, come to a self-conscious realization of our situation. And it reminded me, I don't know if anybody else, it reminded me of a bit of Marx and Lukács, right? Like, if we can become the subject object of history instead of being dictated by blind historical forces, but actually become conscious enough to have an influence in history with our human rationality, then we can enjoy luxury and expenditure without having to, descend into warlike behavior.
I kind of read that a bit differently, as more Nietzschean, kind of. As like a Nietzschean life affirmation at the end, but a bit more literal with like modern science. That's what he was saying. People experience anxiety, which was something we were talking about last one, about how he was talking about anxiety as a problem because they only think of things in a particular situation, like he gave the example of certain people not having certain enough things in the market at a specific time or whatever. But then if you affirm life in general, which he means general economy, you see there's actually an abundance. And so it's less about not being driven by forces, because he kind of makes very explicit in this book, no matter what you do, you will be driven by like the forces of excess. But it's accepting and affirming it instead of denying it, which would be nihilistic.
Yeah, I think that really connects with he doesn't use the term, I don't know if he does at all in this book, but this is basically Nietzsche's idea of the Dionysian, so in The Birth of Tragedy, he says that the Dionysian is this ground of nature that has a contradiction within it. And that contradiction within it is kind of this ecstasy, but also this suffering. And from that, there comes this kind of desire to sublate that, which causes it to split into Dionysian and Apollonian. So it's actually a really complex dichotomy where really the ground is the Dionysian. But that movement of the Dionysian in terms of the particular and the general is, he says, is that's the general movement, where the individual is lost in this movement of life, which is itself a kind of eternal force that that basically destroys but also creates the particular lives. And so that is all over his whole idea, it seems like, of this whole vital movement of an excess of life. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting point about so yeah, this Nietzschean idea of life affirmation, which that's something more he focuses more on after Birth of Tragedy, although it's in Birth of Tragedy, but particularly the aspect that, you know, not be like Schopenhauer and deny it, but to affirm it. But he connects that with this idea of a kind of, okay, it seemed really Hegelian to me, of, well, let's develop a consciousness of it historically, which is also very, you know, who's Marx getting this from? You know, of course, Hegel. So it seemed definitely like a little bit of all of those, but ultimately, I think it's really a Nietzschean approach, I would say, and specifically one that focuses on that Dionysian as kind of the essential aspect of this overarching movement. But the way he connects that specifically with consciousness and self-consciousness, that is definitely not Nietzschean. That's definitely a Hegelian kind of thing. Nietzsche sees consciousness as something very much more secondary to, you know, the instincts and whatnot. That's basically consciousness, and self-consciousness in the kind of Hegelian sense is something that's reactive to Nietzsche, where there's much more primary forces and powers and will and all that great Nietzschean stuff. Yeah, it'd be phenomenal. So I think, yeah, and then in terms of Plato and the Republic.
Define epiphenomenal, please. I don't know that term.
Yeah, that's, so if something is produced by one thing, so this is usually in the philosophy of mind, people usually talk about consciousness being epiphenomenal to the brain, which means basically it's produced by it, but as a kind of specter on the surface of things, or an effect that doesn't actually cause anything itself. So it wouldn't have any kind of power to cause something in this more primary level of usually the material world, though it's usually defined very abstractly in analytic philosophy of mind, because everything's abstract to them and ahistorical. But yeah, that's the kind of idea it seems like he's going with. So Plato, yeah, I think Eric and Nevitt, what you said was basically spot on, and I definitely got that connection there too, especially because he also mentions justice. And what is he puts yeah, justice and freedom kind of connects those. And you know, what is the Republic? It's about justice, of course. And so what I read that in the Republic again, he was talking about, oh, this is you know, the perfect ideal city right here. Everyone's needs are met. It's totally rational. You know, we've got a harmonious city right here. No luxury, nothing. And that really is this equilibrium of organic harmony and unity. That's what Plato really sees as the ideal. And he also sees his ideal state as a purification of that, the luxury of the luxurious city that oversteps this ideal proportionality of harmony between reason, spirit, and the appetites of desire. That if you could have reason rule over all these things, you would go back to a kind of functional utilitarian, the perfect ideal city where there's no luxury. And in a way, there's some sense to that. And I think this is where Plato is very sophisticated. He's an asshole. He's wrong about everything, but he's not stupid. I'll say that.
I'm so confused. I thought you loved him.
So I'm not even sure where like the inside joke or whatnot is on that. I think it was mainly never. Did you say I loved him or something? And then
there was a period. I don't remember if it was in Hegel or where it was, but you were frequently saying "fuck Plato" and things like that, both online and on Discord. So that's
yeah, I just probably misread it. I thought I'd said I love Plato, so it's my bad.
Yeah, there's something about a lot of these philosophers that I hate, that you hate them in a way where you still kind of love them. But I'm not saying I love Plato. I would love to hate.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna, at the top of page 35, the first sentence of the only full paragraph, it's the whole page practically, top of page 35, under the present conditions, independently of our consciousness, sexual reproduction is, together with eating and death, one of the great luxurious detours that ensure the intense consumption of energy.
And I'm wondering how much of that, because the thing that also stuck out to me on page 38 was where he said, under the present conditions, everything conspires to obscure the basic movement that tends to restore wealth to its function, to gift giving, to squandering without reciprocation. When it's also brought to mind what the video was talking about, what was talked about last session, where he has an affinity with using the sun in his example of excess energy that constantly is giving out without reciprocation, is in itself a way to expend it outside of utility. So for me, I thought that was a fascinating point, where it's, because we tend to think of everything in terms of production and utility, from sex to engagement to anything that we do in an economic system. So to have this excess of wealth as energy to be nothing more than a giving of oneself to another being, I thought was fascinating, and also kind of lending very much into the Hegelian concept of self-consciousness being desire. Like, we desire to consume, and then once that reaches a sublation point of consciousness and self-consciousness reflecting on each other, then we have a desire to participate in another economy for like some form of Hegelian sense of self, not only self, but mutual recognition. So I did get like a little bit of Hegel from him, from little I understand of Hegel, but I also like this idea of him constantly using the sun as an example of what excess energy should be, and that he felt that particularly in this moment, the way I read it was that the actual capitalist system obscures what he calls, and I thought it was really important that he called it the basic movement to restore wealth to its function, which is gift giving.
Yeah, that's also pretty much any time he says gift giving, he's probably referencing Marcel Mauss. I don't know how to say that, but the anthropologist.
Who is that?
He's a very important anthropologist who I haven't read yet, but I've been meaning to. He was his most famous book is The Gift, which is basically part of the most important part was it was up until now, most people thought that barter was the original economic system, right? And then if something didn't have markets, it was a barter system. And that barter system was basically just markets without enough surplus to have markets, right? But so Marcel Mauss, The Gift was an anthropological book where he was basically saying, no, that's wrong. The original society is based off of a gift giving, which is not based off of, they said it's not based off of reciprocation. You give the gift not based off of the calculus for how much it is worth or how much you expect to get back. And that is, so I think that's part of what it's saying. That's the original way. And then modern economics have obscured that in capitalism.
I have a question. Thinking about the Republic example and how I think it would, I think maybe Bataille would differ from Plato's and or Socrates' analysis. So, so Socrates says if you start giving into desire, then eventually the desires are going to expand so much that you're going to have to, you're going to run out of resources. So you're going to have to start taking other people's resources. Whereas the sense I get from Bataille is that it goes the other, it's something like the other way around. Like you get this massive production of resources within a community or within some restricted region, and they have to do something with the excess of wealth and resources. And the one of the most common ways that human beings vent that vow is through warfare. And so it seems to be, I mean, if that's correct, and because I'm trying to get in my mind kind of what's the difference between the way Bataille thinks about economy and the way what I think of as the classic model. And it seems like Plato's notion is the sort of classic model. If you run out of resources, and then that causes all sorts of problems like war and death and stuff. Whereas Bataille seems to think that war is a product of excessive wealth. So my two questions is, one, is that correct? And two, if it is, what does he think accounts for the excessive wealth that occurs? Is it just things like technological progress, where we have more efficient agriculture and more efficient production, and so the society just produces lots of stuff? So two questions. Is that correct? Do you think that would Bataille say it's not that we expand because we're running out of resources, but it's in fact, and that's where we get war, but it's in fact, we get there's too much luxury within a contained space, and then we go vent that excess wealth by killing other people? Is that a correct way of putting the difference first? Maybe I should just leave that question there first.
That's the impression I got. I was gonna throw out that it felt like what he was saying, that it counts for that excess, is like a denial of excess. Like there's a denial that we need to expend, and like an attempt to accumulate. And the idea being that like we are growing a surplus, but without the expenditure, the only way to expend it appropriately at that point is going to be destructive and catastrophic.
And would he just say that it's life that causes that excess? Because I'm wondering, where does he think this excess comes from? And I guess, like the example of the jungle and all of that, I guess you could say it's just, life just goes crazy and you start getting all these different forms of life and reproduction and all that. And then maybe within the human economy, maybe it's because we're smart and we start creating more efficient means of productions and stuff like that. I mean, is that what's causing this?
So I think what you're getting at is, what is the underlying metaphysical principle behind this, which he doesn't really specify, which is probably intentional because that's a pretty difficult topic to get into. But he seems to me like he kind of posits, usually in the language of vital energy and movement, and that there just is this excess of energy, and that's where these things ultimately come from. This kind of, I don't know if he would what he would call it in terms of metaphysics or whatnot, but it seems like that is primary, but he doesn't really specify exactly how that comes about. I mean, if anything, you could continue further back and try to figure out, well, what caused that, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it's about desire and whatnot. I think he's getting at something where that desire is definitely because of that excessive factor, where he's going against Plato's idea where, okay, I desire because I lack something. I am hungry, therefore I desire food, something like that. But there's another idea of desire where, so Bataille wouldn't want to use the language production here or productive, but I think you could maybe say something like creative, in the sense that it's the very idea of desire as something, well, I want to go beyond myself in order to get something, possess something, do something, act upon the world in some way. That act of kind of constituting relations with something beyond yourself, that desires something kind of like that, which is also part of this movement of life outside of its kind of fixed form into that excess, is yeah, that's what desire seems like to Bataille. I would say is that, okay, you've got maybe plant life and asexual reproduction, you got mosses and whatnot, it's all good, but that's a city for pigs. We need something, ultimate. It's interesting that Plato does this, where he says, okay, you have that city for pigs, but he readily acknowledges, well, that's ridiculous. People will never go along with that. So there's already this kind of primary position of desire swinging things wildly out of balance, of this excess. So he understands, Plato does, that there is this excess quality to desire, but the thing is, he wants to purify that and control it, and it is part of this idea of neglecting that disequilibrium that's at the heart of everything, because ultimately he sees things as a static. So yeah, as far as sexual reproduction and whatnot, that's what he's getting at, is that we don't need all these forms. There is something just inherently excessive that leads towards these greater complexity of relations between life and itself, that is also built into the very movement of life, where it creates its particular forms, so that it's always going to be exceeding these forms that it creates. And that is this kind of idea of desire as something constitutive and creative, where it can bring about something, create something, but yet is not limited to it, but is always going to create these particular viewpoints within it. So yeah, Plato sucks.
I don't know. You say that so often, I don't believe you.
He's a worthy enemy. He is a worthy enemy. I'll give him that.
Yeah, the way Chase seems to think of Plato the way I think Nietzsche thought of him, which is he was really smart, really creative and innovative, and he really fucked up Western culture and philosophy. He used all that power and went the wrong direction. But I think Nietzsche has tremendous respect for him, but he also hates what he did, and that sounds like how Chase feels. Speaking of Nietzsche, this was popped in my mind when Chase was talking about the Nietzschean influences on this. At the very bottom of page 38, the last partial sentence, anguish, this all sounds very much like Nietzsche to me. Anguish arises when the anxious individual is not himself stretched tight by the feeling of superabundance. This is precisely what evinces the isolated individual character of anguish. There can be anguish only from a personal, particular point of view that is radically opposed to the general point of view based on the exuberance of living matter as a whole. Anguish is meaningless for someone who overflows with life, and for life as a whole, which is overflowing by its very nature. And Nietzsche says something like there are two kinds of people who suffer from, I don't know if it's the excesses, but people who suffer from life and people who rejoice, in the causes of suffering. And that sounds like he's really channeling Nietzsche there, because the kind of ideal person for Nietzsche is this person who is super abundant and overflowing and has all this excess power and energy that he's got to do something with. And he describes like the ancient masters as being, I don't think he thinks anybody today is, we're all today a weird mixture of master and slave and all that. But the sort of or I don't even know what to say paradigm, but the ancient case is you have this person who's just so overflowing with power and energy. He literally gives things away because he just needs to do something with all this wealth and with this power. He's just got to dispense with it. He's got to find a vent. And, if you look at Aristotle's virtue of generosity, there's a similar kind of a thing where, where a person just has too much. And when he has too much, he's got to give it away. And Aristotle actually says, the truly generous person will give away so much to where he suffers just a little bit from a little bit of over generosity. And so, I think, Nietzsche's drawing on these ancient, at least his analysis of those sort of ancient cultures where you have individuals who have this superabundance and they have this need. And, Nietzsche talks about the beasts of prey in a society. So, when you begin to enclose people within the constraints of society to where people have to obey all the social rules, there are these individuals in these societies, and I think he's thinking again of ancient societies, the individuals who just have so much pent up energy, they've got to do something. And so what they do is they go and raid other communities. And maybe Bataille would agree with that analysis and say, well, similar things happen today, but we need to figure out something to do with it other than raiding other societies. But it seems to be a similar kind of thing. You get all this pent up energy, and somebody has to find a vent, someplace for it to go.
I thought it was interesting when you were talking about superabundance and this classical notion, which you're drawing from Nietzsche and his examination of the vitality, right? I thought it was interesting in the case of Beowulf. I never get the chance to talk about Beowulf, so thank you, Nevin, for this opening. But in the introduction, it gives a list of kings, of ancestors of Beowulf, right? And the best thing that can be said about them, was that they were a ring giver, right? That they gave away treasure. Like, that's the highest compliment that you can receive back then. And all the actions of these lords was to just acquire so much wealth that you have so much that you have to give it away. So I thought that was an interesting literary allusion right there with Beowulf, Nietzschean Bataille analysis. Yeah.
I was also thinking, I know I keep bringing this back to anthropology, but a description I read from a book, which was of chiefs in some societies where they are the poorest person in the entire society just because they're so generous that they end up giving away more than everyone else. And I just thought of that.
Yeah. It's instead of accumulation, you show your status, your higher status by what you're giving away. You know, and when we say giving away, it's not like necessarily private property, but it's spending the money for so the village can have a fiesta, right? Can pay for the religious procession, and you're basically paying for the year-long parties that follow the more traditional religious calendar.
Yeah, I think you can see that in the Homeric idea of a kind of honor and glory. So honor is maybe a little tricky, but I think the idea of glory as something of, why do these people fight in this stupid war to get back, this woman they don't hardly even deal with it. What is it? It's just some kind of glory, so there's definitely something not just kind of irrational from a Platonic perspective, but very much this excessive kind of life-affirming kind of way of seeing your own mortality, I think, in a way where they're not trying to hold on to this aspect of their life and just simply kind of go by in a fashion of, how long can I get in quantity wise, just extend my life. It's about these intensities of life that define this idea of glory that make life worth living. It seems like that's kind of like the Homeric idea. And I think that's also what Nietzsche was drawing on, that he liked about the Greeks. But then Plato is basically saying, no, that this idea is terrible. You're basically who's even judging this glory or giving someone the idea of honor that requires, other people. And this actually, Aristotle has a criticism in the same way. But so Plato also, I think he talks about, he has some interesting connections with this in the sense that, okay, his society is tripartite society, where you've got, the rational philosopher king guardians up top. They have wisdom, they know everything. They know everything works together. Then you got this soldier class, the auxiliaries, who follow orders. That's what they do. But their chief faculty is spirit, or thumos, which is kind of this, it goes along with this Homeric idea of a kind of glory of battle and whatnot. And I think that's where he sees it, is that idea of suppressing that so it follows orders instead of gives orders. That's this idea of, the city for pigs, as opposed to the kind of glorious city where I think that's something like the luxurious city that he's hinting at, something that's ruled by glory and honor and whatnot. Yeah, and then you have the working class producers, the crafts people who can't give logical discursive accounts of their techne, their craft, and therefore they're stupid, is they can't have a rational explanation of what they're doing. The same way you can't have a rational explanation of, something like an artist over what they're doing. So, but then again, what is, I think what Bataille is kind of getting back towards is that kind of techne, in the sense of a craft, of this creative aspect of things, where it isn't something so much that's conscious, because he talks about it as something that's, well, the particular perspective is this thing that is about, he says it's personal, and particular, personal, and isolated point of view that has this anguish that goes about it. So I think that's interesting that you have that element to it compared to this kind of superabundance, this overflowing exuberance of living matter as a whole in general. So it always has something that's going beyond where you could give a rational account of it. And that's kind of connected also with this idea of like utilitarian planning, that it exceeds that in a lot of really fundamental ways.
Yeah, thoughts bubbling around in my head. I see him talking about kind of like death as that like luxury, and I think like that kind of glory, honor, nobility. I think or like the utilitarian perspective is like that's not useful, and it paints it as if it's against life. And I guess Bataille is trying to paint it, or trying to like kind of reverse this and say like, well, life comes about from this overflow. Like this overflow is, I'm kind of responding to the note that Ripley's making about like affirming life, and kind of like what does that mean to Bataille. And it appears to me that he's saying like, yeah, this kind of like Dionysian overflow, sexuality, eating, death, sacrifice, giving, is this way of kind of affirming life. And it's like he's saying life is not just useful and productive, which I feel like I like to think at times, that just like, I feel like I've from a Nietzschean perspective, and I don't necessarily know if this is right or not, but like I think of that like critique on the transcendental, and it's just like, oh, like I need to turn my efforts, like whether like my religious or spiritual beliefs, like how do I apply those to this world and make them about this world, as a way of like trying to convince myself and others who I might have this conversation with, like how do you make your religious spiritual beliefs, practices useful for this life. And it's weird, it feels like what Bataille is saying of like, you trying to like appropriate and utilize your spiritual practice, is like life negating, is like, it kind of like ignores the fact that like that which gives meaning to those practices is the very fact that like they are not useful, they're not productive, and they're pointing towards like something else that isn't necessarily right here right now, that you've already appropriated.
So I'd really like to get into how he conceived art, because like that's what I'm interested in too, is like how do you wrap up art and sexuality in this? Because is it like an expression of the exuberance of energy in and of itself that needs to be done without a general purpose? But I think that might be getting a little bit outside of the context of this book.
One thing I don't understand. I get so when he's talking about sexuality in this chapter, I think a lot of it was directed toward that, again, sexual reproduction as opposed to asexual reproduction. But then I also get the sense, like with the tiger comment and stuff like that, maybe, I don't know, but that human passionate sexuality is also a luxury in some sense. I'm not exactly sure how, what, maybe he hasn't, maybe you'll say more about it later, but I'm not sure how that fits in. Someone enlighten me. Joey, are you saying huh to my comment?
I said huh to Chase's comment, and I was going to ask you to repeat what you just said because I was distracted.
I was about to ask you to repeat also.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Huh to everybody.
Too much vodka.
You made total sense.
Not enough vodka.
So my question is, so in the chapter we were looking at for this time, sexuality as a luxury, I took to, that it was luxurious because he was making a distinction between sexual reproduction and asexual reproduction. So, asexual reproduction is sufficient to keep an organism going by duplicating itself. But then sexual reproduction, where the offspring are different from either parent, is a kind of luxury. One, I'm not exactly sure why that's a luxury. But then my main question was but then he also seems to, I'm not sure about this. I assumed he also meant that actual just human sexuality. In other words, the practice of, pardon my language, fucking is somehow a physical and an emotional luxury as well. And I did have a vague sense that he would say that, but I don't really know why. And I was wondering if anyone, if I'm wrong about that, or if somebody.
I think he did say it directly somewhere. I'm not sure where, but I feel like I remember him like making the distinction. He said sexual reproduction like in one sentence, and then like in the same paragraph, he said something like, but sexuality. It felt like he was making the distinction of saying, we can go a step further and recognizing its excess.
I think you interpreted him correctly, Robert, on that point.
So Eric, what could you say? You said sexuality is excessive to the needs of the individual organism. What you mean by that?
Oh, I'm not going to pretend like I understand like exactly where Bataille is coming from here, but my sense is that, right, luxury is what is, in excess of our needs. And strictly speaking, none of us need to procreate. The species needs to procreate. So from the standpoint of the species, reproduction might be necessary, but from the standpoint of myself, right, it's an excess, right? It's concentration of energy, right, in time. It's an excess of my needs.
And then when we think just sexuality in general, like just for fun, it's, there's no need on the species part. There's no need on the individual part.
Yeah, that's part of his definition of luxury.
It's not fun for me. It's business and it's utility.
So here's the way I've always thought of sexuality.
Sorry.
In sort of a conventional sense, but I think again this is I'm thinking Bataille would say this is that whatever conventional notion of a restricted economy that's sort of deeply set in my mind. From an evolutionary standpoint, if genes are going to replicate themselves and in this sexual way, then you have to make it intensely pleasurable, or the process of evolution had the effect of making the sexual act intensely pleasurable, because that's the way you get replication of genes. And so in that sense, and so that conventional model doesn't sound luxurious to me. It just, like, even the pleasure, maybe you could say, well, the pleasure is excessive, or people do this too much. On the other hand, if the movement of evolution is the propagation of the replication of genes, that would make sense from just, so it appears to be luxury, but really it's just this biological mechanism for propagating genes. And I'm wondering if maybe Bataille would, give some other spin on that.
Well, Bataille also said there was in real life, there was no like pure productive labor and pure productive and impure productive, impure excess, we were saying there's no, like, you know what I'm saying? Like the real life, things would usually be a mix of both somewhat.
A mix of what? Production and what?
Unproduction, excess, waste.
Yeah, so it's kind of like what, kind of just real quick, what Bergson says about certain tendencies that are dual is that you see them as completely separate as an ideal way of thinking of them as limits of tendencies, like that space and time are different as in the sense of different types of movement in different ways, but everything that actually exists is always a combination of those, a mixture. So I think that's what he's getting at.
On page 35, like in the middle, he says, sexuality differs from miserly growth. If with regard to the species, sexuality appears as a growth, in principle, it is nevertheless a luxury of individuals. This characteristic is more accentuated in sexual reproduction, where the individuals engendered are clearly separate from those that engender them and give them life as one gives to others. But without renouncing a subsequent return to the principle of growth for the period of nutrition, the reproduction of the higher animals has not ceased to deepen the fault that separates it from simple tendency to eat in order to increase volume and power. For these animals, sexual reproduction is the occasion of a sudden and frantic squandering of energy resources, carried in a moment to the limit of possibility. So there's two things there, right? He's separating the individual from the group, from the species, and Nevitt mentioned that earlier. And the second is how we actually view sexual reproduction along with death and other luxuries.
So
Another,
go ahead.
I feel like I may be sidetracking off that. So if you had something directly to respond. I was going to say another thing that's kind of coming to my mind is like the idea of like appropriation, and how like it's easier for us to say like appropriate a lot of our acts into utility. And I feel like Bataille will say that like every act is an act of excess, and that a lot of us are just very used to appropriating it. And I think it sounds like what he's saying is that we oftentimes ignore the fact that it's done out of excess, and that by appropriating it, you know, we're trying to like utilize it to create an accumulation. And I guess I'm looking too at the sentences at the bottom of 38, and that this is the second to last section, where he's saying this, and that's where he kind of talks on anguish. He says atmosphere of malediction. Of course, the fact of being at the beginning of that section, the fact of being afraid of turning away from the movement of dilapidation impels us, even defines us. It's not surprising. The consequences of this movement are distressing from the start. To me, I'm reading that as like, that's our, like, you know, appropriating. That's our denial. I guess that's what, like, I'm reading that as him saying, you know, maybe this is the room where we can make the change, which is, you know, contradictory to the whole project of describing this. But I think that's his, like, you know, impossible project.
So what that makes me think is what he might say is that the, you know, this view of evolution, that all of our thinking about everything is sort of saturated with this older economic model, this restrictive economy. And so then we, you know, the biologists and so on will maybe unconsciously read the evolution in those terms, in these sort of narrowly utilitarian terms, when maybe he would say, if you look at it more objectively, really what you see is this again, you know, Chase keeps making these connections with like creative evolution, but, you know, maybe if you really look at this clear evolution, for example, in a more clear-eyed way, you actually see this constant excess rather than just kind of this bare utilitarian thing of, you know, genetic propagation.
I think, yeah, and the interesting, like, I find this resistance every time we hear Bergson, because I feel like Bergson paints it in a pretty light, you know, like creative, right? Creative is a very positive word. Whereas I feel like Bataille wants to say that, and it's interesting that in that very sentence that I just read, he says, which impels us and even defines us. Almost like he's saying, like, it's absolutely necessary for us, or it's, you know, it's impossible for us to recognize what he's trying to talk about. And, you know, listening to different people speak about Bataille, I think that's where they get at him, you know, the critique of him being like a mystic of sorts. And that, like, I think what he is trying to talk about is something impossible. And he's almost painting it in this light where, like, there's no way we can possibly not try to be utilitarian. I think it's almost to me like he's saying it's less so just we're saturated with the utilitarian perspective, but like, you know, consciousness itself, you know, the way we interpret things necessarily is like, you know, appropriating. And it is always going to miss out on something, you know, and it just kind of begs the question of like, what's the point of this project he's doing? And a lot of like secondary texts I'm reading, the people are saying like, you know, that's the problem with the project. And it's so, and another thing, like I used the word appropriating a few times, and I had read something about like this person talking about like a lot of us want to, or a typical critic will try to reject or accept a writer. And Bataille like resists this like rejection and or acceptance, right? It's like you can't read him and affirm him. It's like to affirm him would to have been to misread him as well as to reject him. And that's, you know, they talk about him like the philosopher of the impossible. And to me, I'm like starting to see that where he's like saying it's almost like when he says and even defines us, it's like he's saying we can't get around this being afraid and turning away from it. But this is the problem. And I guess it's scary to read that. I read his psychological structure of fascism, and it definitely kind of like left me behind, but it was like almost scary. And it felt like I was just like, is that what he's trying to do, of create an image through his writing, you know, his work of art, that's supposed to kind of like shake us and make us tremble. And he has other notions like the subversive image, which I think he gets into that of like, you know, the point of writing, the point of art, the point of, you know, he writes a lot of like crazy erotic stuff. And it's like he's trying to like shake up our world with these like, what you might call like a heterogeneous image. You know, it's just interesting to kind of like try to insert myself in how he's resisting my understanding. Sorry to bring y'all into that. Yes, limit. He takes it to the limit.
And it's kind of fascinating for me too in regards to his conception of sexuality, because I really want to go into it, because, you know, we're trained from a society of production that masturbation is inherently bad. But from, I think, a Bataille standpoint, masturbation could be a way to expel energy, and it's not. It's just a useless act of able to expel this excess energy we have. And I'm wondering if he's kind of extending that into sexual relations as well. Like sexuality is an act akin to masturbation, but in the fact that it's not so much a hedonistic act as it is one that allows us, like the sun, to expel excess energy in non-utilitarian or socially accepted manners of sexuality, which could include masturbation, any form of sexual relations between consenting adults. I don't know. So I found that fascinating.
That definitely, yeah, that was sticking out to me. And like we've been trying to give our own little examples of like excess and how we might expend it. And I mean, the biggest one that sticks out to me is just at the end of the day when I'm stressed, you know, whether it's masturbation or like reading philosophy, it's like, how do I expend the anxiety that I can't stop and I can't rest? You know, I can't just like do something useful. It's like, I need to finish all my to-dos, all my necessary tasks. Because at the end of the day, it's like, what do we really want? We want to like, you know, feed our desire. We want to do something that's like totally pointless, right? Maybe I can play some video games. Again, yeah, read Bataille. Or yeah, masturbate, have sex.
Yeah, because we're so
down.
ingrained in the production mindset, right? Like we're not using the excess energy. We're just feeding into the machine of production that continues to grow this sense of anxiety he seems to talk about. That's an excellent point with the video games too.
Yeah, and I feel like one like just scary thought that I've like tried to, and I don't know, like is just, you know, just taking Bataille too seriously. But this idea of like, can I do anything that my mind isn't capable of appropriating and like rendering of like, oh, this is beneficial for me? You know, like I mean, my new job, like I'm a wellness person. I'm all about like talking about how to do everything for the sake of health and like, you know, benefiting yourself and your growth. and you know, like I feel like I do have practices that I, you know, can consider expenditure. but even those, like, it's so easy for me to, in my efforts to justify and not feel like, you know, a lousy piece of shit, it's always framed as like, oh, well, this is useful because ... And, you know, I feel like Bataille is saying, like, you know, that tendency to try to make everything so useful, you know, that if you take that too far and you get war. And it does remind me of, like, you know, that Nietzschean idea of, like, he recognizes that kind of like internal pressure we've created on ourselves, and this is like a good thing, right? Like, Christianity is not necessarily a bad thing. It created this inward growth. It just makes me think of, like, my own development, where it felt like there was a lot of, say, anxiety and inward, like, you know, inward tearing into oneself, creating depth. And now it's a matter of, like, you know, trying to expend that all the time with, like, external things. I guess there's, like, it appropriates in both directions.
So one thing that I was thinking about was, you know, in terms, he talks about this difference between the ancient mindset of worldview or something like that and our modern one, where our modern worldview has really taken on this viewpoint to a much greater intensity, this utilitarian viewpoint. And I wonder, I mean, just in terms of my own rather stupid experience, I remember when I was a kid and my parents would leave me home alone for a little bit. My dad would often say, just as a kind of reflex, do something productive, and then would leave. And it seemed like the most fucking ridiculous thing for 12-year-old Chase to, like, do something productive while his parents were gone. And it was just this idea of completely alien viewpoints basically interacting, where all I wanted to do was play Diablo 2, and I'll plead the fifth on everything else, but basically I wanted to play computer games. And that's what I cared about. It was just fun. And it was a complete waste of hundreds of hours of my life playing these stupid computer games. But that was, it seemed like something I had to do. The idea of doing something productive was clearly ridiculous. But now it really is something like I can't get out of, especially in this aspect of thinking about what should I do? Where, yeah, I'm constantly doing this of thinking, basically, I guess it's the voice of dad in my head being like, do something productive, Chase. And it's like, okay, well, I'll read Bataille, but that's because it corresponds with my thesis. And, you know, it'd be something like that. So, but that's from a pretty limited viewpoint, because there's also this aspect where you feel this a kind of forced movement of your just feelings, I guess you could call, if Travis was here. Hunter's not even here to even get the joke. But you have this aspect that is, okay, I'll try to do whatever homework or something because that's productive and rational to do. But then occasionally I'll just like, you know, I can't do this anymore. I give up. But in that feeling though, of just like going over to that other side, on the other side of rationality and planning and calculating, where you could see it as something that kind of emerges out of some aspect of yourself that isn't connected with your individual rational thought in a very specific way, but is still kind of underlying it. And it would be something like, I'm just going to like click around on the internet and follow these dopamine feedback loops, basically, because I can't do anything else. And I think there's something like that, where that's kind of that excess of the rational the Bataille is getting at. That's, I mean, that's not dopamine feedback loops particularly, but there's that kind of contrast between the rational planning where, because it's impossible to think of that kind of, even to describe this is this impossible thing that he's trying to describe is, you know, to think of the thing that can't be thought, or to inject into thought itself what isn't thought, which sounds, you know, like some contradictory Hegelian thing, but I think that's this kind of idea of a shock to thinking that he's really getting at. With to think of something as impossible is itself a kind of shock to the faculty that it's impossible for. And that's kind of what he's trying to get us to think is, you know, this is a movement within consciousness, but it's also something that isn't just consciousness in that limited sense. So it's kind of a violence to consciousness that he's trying to inject within consciousness or thought or all these things. And that's what's impossible about it. But yet at the same time, that's also this kind of excess of this particular viewpoint where I'm rationalizing and thinking, be productive, Chase, from the perspective of Chase, this very particular abstract entity. Yes, I'm sneaking. Actually, though, you know what? I haven't mentioned his name at all, so I'm not going to do it. But no, they're on to the same thing, definitely, in terms of injecting a shock to thinking by the intensity of what is not thought, or the limit of thought. Yeah.
Yeah, Deleuze snuck Bataille into the conversation.
I think you're right. No, seriously. Okay. That article I posted, it's about that connection, which there's remarkably little academic scholarly work kind of connecting those ideas. But that article, it talks about Bataille and Deleuze in terms of philosophy as a life practice and ascesis, you know, like where asceticism comes from, and these kind of different traditions of, you know, you got the Stoics who think of life as, or think of philosophy as this life thing where you correspond with nature as this rational principle and kind of go along with it. So you have this harmony with this cosmic force, but then, you know, today, like modern Stoicism, it completely leaves that out to go along with this utilitarian thing of, you know, think about these Stoic principles in order so that you can work harder and make more money or something like that, or you can be happier at your job that exploits you and all these things. But the Stoics saw it as a kind of cosmic force that exceeded the individual, but the idea was the individual needs to change and transform themselves in order to correspond with that harmony of this cosmic principle. And that article is basically saying that Bataille and Deleuze are doing something similar, but it's not this rational ordering principle, but instead this, you know, violent energy that is excessive of any kind of order of reason or any kind of organic fixed structure or anything like that. And that's where they have different methods of going about, of transforming the self kind of itself. But then that gets into this whole kind of recursive thing of this impossibility of trying to transform the thing that would be transforming. And, you know, that's why it sounds so contradictory to talk about, you know, the impossibility, or really anything impossible is kind of contradictory to talk about in a certain sense. But that, yeah, I think that's this life practice aspect of how the individual would sort of relate to this general economy as a movement but then the whole thing about it is that it's about going past the individual in order to understand that. So the individual would have to understand something that is very much beyond the individual, which I feel like I've said like a billion times today already. So I think with that, I will stop talking.
I don't know if anybody else has further speculational thoughts, but I found myself kind of very confused, or just with a lot of question marks. I found it very interesting, but there's partly confusion. Partly I'd like to hear maybe us dive and look more directly at the text from pages like 38 to the end. I was particularly, say, question marks on just the like relevant. I didn't really get what he was saying about rise in general standard of living, and then at the end kind of like, you know, he returns to that. I guess I didn't really like totally feel like I missed that. I think that's like my general question that may like, you know, wind us back to understanding other things. But yeah, the living standard thing threw me off. And I feel like I saw Hegel all over the last 2 pages. I was curious if anybody else saw that.
In my notes on the last 2 pages, I have Hegel written 3 times. So yes, you are not alone. And at least for me, the way I interpreted the raising of the living standard, hey, there it is, you too, yes, yeah, was that it goes into the fact of kind of like what the video was talking about with the machine for pigs, is that when you start taking this excess energy and directing it back into production to raise the living standards without any expulsion for no general utility or purpose, that it kind of doesn't really do anything that further but perpetuate the problem. And from the Hegelian aspect, it seems to be that he's saying that lucidity of thought, it's like Hegel's whole concept of the absence of something is the presence of something. So by recognizing that raising the living standards or participating more in a system of production that doesn't really do anything other than just kind of perpetuate the energy back into expressing it into more production for more energy, is in itself an inherent problem. It's a contradiction. But in a way, it brings about one of the stepping stones needed to jump from consciousness to self-consciousness, or at least that's the way I interpreted it.
So is this raising of the living standard, is that like, maybe it's just a bad question, but is that like a positive thing or a negative thing?
I think it's both. I think it's both in the fact that when you look at what the raising of the living standards is, it's a preconceived notion of production that in and of itself is not really a solution, and it's negative, but it's positive because it can bring about an understanding of why it's not a good solution.
I thought he might have been suggesting raising of the standard of living is a better solution than, or a better way to expend excess resources than war, maybe. But, and that there's, I mean, at the end you get this kind of almost libertarian thing of, you know, the resentment against the wealthy, you know, who are accumulating wealth, and we get pissed off at them because, you know, we want them, everybody to be equal. Anyway, that's the kind of, which I found a little bit troubling, but I thought he was suggesting that the raising a standard of living was an alternative way of expending excess resources. Kind of like, you know, earlier he had said, why didn't we just give all that stuff to India? You know, they're poor, rather than having another war. Why don't we just, you know, give it away to India?
Yeah, I think he was saying that it's a good idea to raise that standard of living, you know, okay, this excess energy has to go somewhere. Why not do it towards raising the standard of living instead of war? Especially if they're both going to be useless in some manner, at least do the useless thing that doesn't result in World War II and Holocaust and whatnot.
I guess I'm confused because like that just seems so kind of like practical and useful.
Yeah,
And I
he
feel like
talks.
he's been saying that like we can't
So
do that.
he
I don't
says,
know.
where's he talks about that as like, this is, yeah, here it is. But it cannot be lifted if the movement from which it emanates does not appear clearly in consciousness. In this regard, it seems rather disappointing to have nothing more to propose as a remedy for the catastrophe that threatens than the raising of the living standard, in quotes. This recourse, as I have said, is linked to a refusal to see in its truth the exigency to which the recourse is intended to respond. Yet if one considers at the same time the weakness and the virtue of this situation, two things become immediately apparent: that it is the only one capable of rather wide acceptance, and that, due to its equivocal nature, it provokes and stimulates an effort of lucidity all the greater for seeming to be far removed from such an effort. In this way, the avoidance of the truth ensures in a reciprocal fashion a recognition of the truth. So that's definitely corresponding with that whole impossibility kind of thinking itself sort of thing. And he's acknowledging that this is rather disappointing, but yeah, I'm not sure really what to make of this though, overall.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear maybe like Eric or Nevitt expound on the, like, yeah, not utility, but it's humane. And I guess like, yeah, it just makes me kind of like calls to question like, hey, what utility? Now what am I even thinking of utility? And I guess that was my problem earlier of saying like, I have a hard time like imagining anything outside the scope of utility.
So I can't remember the name of the famous utilitarian, but there's a
Jeremy Bentham.
Huh?
Jeremy Bentham.
No, a contemporary one.
Oh.
His name starts with an S, maybe.
Singer.
Like
What's that?
Peter
Singer, Peter Singer, yeah. And so
Yes.
Peter Singer suggested that everyone in the world, or everyone in wealthy countries, should reduce their standard of living to the level of marginal utility, so that the excess in resources could be shared with, the rest of the world, and that everyone in wealthy society should do that until the standard of living of the entire world is raised up to some, to basically the same. And then if you want to, you can start building luxury on top of that. But we need to collapse the luxury in the, among the wealthy nations and spread that out among the poor nations. And so that's a utilitarian. So it's utilitarian in the sense that you're trying to meet people's needs, so you reduce your standard of living to the level of marginal utility. And that's still utility, but you've scraped away the luxury, and you're spreading the luxury out to bring the rest of the world up to the level of marginal utility.
And that's different than what Bataille is saying, question mark.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's the kind of thing he's saying, luxury is an excess over and above that. And I'm thinking, I don't know, but I'm guessing Bataille would say there is probably sufficient resources in the world to bring a significant amount of luxury to the entire world, is my guess. And he talks about how you get these weird imbalances where you get these regions of death and these regions of life, this inequitable distribution, but that doesn't have to do with limited resources. It has to do with, environmental conditions and unjust economic policies and stuff like that. But I think that might be where he would disagree with the utilitarian, like Singer, is that no, we do have enough resources to raise the entire world. And for example, if you took the trillions of dollars that Western economies are throwing into the military, and you spread that into raising the standard of living of everyone in the world, then we all might be living a much better life rather than living at mere marginal utility.
Almost like he's just saying, like, let's assume excess for everyone.
Well, I think he thinks there is a real excess. I'm not sure if Chase and I disagree with this. I don't really see him making any sort of metaphysical or needing any metaphysical arguments. I mean, I think he's talking like literal energy. Like you get this excess of energy from the sun slamming into the earth, and that the energy that slamming into the earth is way more than you need for maintaining and developing life. And then the energy, the increase in productivity and all of that kind of stuff in Western societies is way more than you need to provide for mere utility for the rest of the world. And so I think Bataille thinks I don't think he's as much making sort of an ethical argument as he's making just something like an argument from physics and economy. There is just a shit ton of energy here that we're just not using. And it's just, it's there, it is here. It's a matter of figuring out where it is, harnessing it, and distributing it. So, I mean, I think he really believes there really is an excess of energy available in the system.
I guess, yeah, I would lean more towards the fact of saying that excess energy recycled back into the system is inherently utilitarian and counterintuitive to what he has said so far. So I'm curious where he actually goes with this, because he seems to suggest that the first step is to break away from the mindset of recycling back into the system with the excess energy, which is done with lucidity and self-consciousness. Now, how is my question, and where he further develops it throughout this text, because I really be curious how he proposes that. So maybe next week.
Well, Joey pointed out this sort of pessimistic feature of his, thought. If you look at on page 40, the first sentence in that last section, it has to be added at once, however, that however well defined the solutions, their implementation on the required scale is so difficult that from the outset, the undertaking hardly looks encouraging. And that, that whole last section is kind of pessimistic. So I don't.
Well, even the title of the book is pessimistic, The Accursed Share.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, absolutely.
So I haven't read any of the secondary literature, and Joey's been reading some of that, but apparently that.
Whoa! What secondary literature, Joey? You can't just hold that to yourself. What is this? What is the secondary literature? You got to put this in chat and Discord.
I've just been sifting through like essays, so no particular text, but just kind of, if you Google search like Bataille secondary, I found two.
Oh my
PDF
God,
books.
are you seriously telling me to Google search it? Okay, I'll do that. All right, Joey.
Post some stuff on the Discord.
Let me Google that for you. All right, I'm sorry.
So,
I mean, I can share them. I found a lot of stuff. It's exciting, but it's definitely just kind of me like, excessively spinning out.
No, please, yeah, excessively spin out. Place it in Discord chat, please.
yeah, Joey, you need to get on Discord. You need to give it the time.
I
It'll
think
be good for you. It'll be good for your health.
The utility of getting on Discord, Joey.
Yeah. Okay, so I think one dimension of this whole thing that is related that we haven't really got into is it's something it doesn't get into, I guess, until I think I guess you'll get into, but okay, this religious element is he was a big advocate of this idea that there's a certain type of religious experience that was a huge part also of the ancient world that has fundamentally changed. And that's part of why there's this kind of utilitarian atomistic idea of ourselves. So he talks about it somewhat in the notion of expenditure. With the whole Protestant work ethic, the idea of, in Catholicism, you have rituals at least, and you have more this community kind of ethos. But then in Protestantism, where you got this emphasis on the salvation of the individual through their own individual means and whatnot, that this is something that is fundamentally wrong, in that I think for Bataille, the religious experience is going to be inherently something communal, and not in the sense of you have a bunch of individuals just kind of smudged together, but in the sense that the individual is kind of violently dissolved and identifies with the movement of whatever you're going to call it, energy in general, that is this excessive general economy movement, energy, Dionysian, blah, 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 we've been talking about the whole time. So
spirit
that
Chase.
element, yeah, so that element is really important to, I think, understanding something like, you know, even the whole notion of trying to understand something like what he's doing with these economic proposals and whatnot, or I can't remember, but yeah, that element of the Dionysian as specifically having so it's hard to think of it outside the ideas of utility, but that it had this effect where excess energy was spent through these religious festivals and whatnot in a way that prevented the kind of formation and calcification of the individual as this atomic unit that we are inflicted with today and that we can't get out of. And that we need, in order to, like, that's the thing that shocks, thought into, or whatever, into thinking something impossible, is something like that religious experience where you no longer identify with your separate ego. And that's where, yeah, this sounds like mysticism because it is, but that was his thing. So, yeah.
I think that, that section of the particular and the general, it seems to me that's exactly what he's getting at. He says this is the top of 39 again, there can only be anguish from a personal particular point of view that is radically opposed to the general point of view based on the exuberance of living matter as a whole. Anguish is meaningless for someone who overflows with life, and for life as a whole, which is overflowing by its very nature. And you see that kind of thinking, like Chase was saying, and you see it in Buddhism, you see it in Hinduism. Like, I don't remember the details, but in the Bhagavad Gita, when whoever Arjuna and Krishna are talking, he's like, God, this is awful. All these people are going to die on this battlefield. And Krishna's like, yeah, but if you look at this sort of from this cosmic point of view, individuals are kind of part of this whole dance of reality. And in Buddhism, you get this sense of in a certain state of consciousness, the individual ego dissolves, and so I think, but I don't know. So I don't know what he's proposing here. If he, like as a way of entering into this, if he really is proposing a sort of mysticism, or if he's suggesting, because Nietzsche. That sentence I read sounds very much like Nietzsche. And my advisor, when I was working on my dissertation, said that he sees evidence in Zarathustra and other places where Nietzsche seems to suggest that if you, in the sort of Schopenhauerian mode, if you find a way of experiencing yourself as the movement of life, the movement of the sort of almost the cosmic play of the will to power, the child, that these anxieties of radical individualized existence sort of evaporate. And so that, because Bataille is saying their anguish is all about, it's the individual that has anguish. Whereas if you experience yourself as a feature of this, this sort of cosmic play of forces, then that anxiety kind of evaporates. But then the trouble with that is then you begin to ask, you begin to worry about Yeah, but does that mean that the suffering of the individual person, it has no value anymore? And and then that's when the whole thing with justice and freedom begin to crop in as a problem.
And
In a way,
this is
you kind
probably
of just explained my religious point of view. That's my religion. That's also, but it has to do with sacrificing stuff, specifically babies. But we'll get into that next time.
I do want to try one of your cool baby sandwiches one of these days. I do want to go
Put that
also
in the
like
bingo card.
yeah. I do want to go into also probably next week how he tied almost seemingly volition and death in the same sentence, because I know we're probably out of time right now, but if I can remember it, I'll put it in the Discord. I would like to discuss how earlier on he seemed to say that death and volition seemed to have almost a life-affirming, almost dialectical relationship. So that's certainly something I'd like to discuss next time, but I'll forget, which is why I'm saying it now, and I need to remember to put it in the Discord.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about that too. So we'll try to remember. But also, yeah, where the hell is Hunter?
I know, right? So has
He's
a
probably
life.
like, you guys didn't think Bataille was connected to Hegel, and then we got to this last page. He's like,
So,
"Fuck yeah,
somewhere he's
I'm
doing the
leaving this."
oh, but it is. Yeah.
I did notice last week though, he started full of energy and within 15 minutes he was like not present until
Yeah, but he said he was imbibing a little bit. So I was wondering if that was it. I would love to be around Drunk Hunter. I would pay money to hang out with Drunk Hunter.
Part of it was that he felt sort of
Shut down.
yeah.
Oh, about the
That
reading
was the
structure.
phrase.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got that impression as well.
It was not here today either.
Maybe
Did
they're
not
out
have
having
artificial structure.
maybe they're out getting drunk together. That was
So
probably
no one's gonna
a good
no
thing.
one's gonna explain the last 3 sentences to me. Because Hunter's not here.
I have
Yeah.
a big question mark by the whole last paragraph. So
It felt very important.
The last
Yes.
one to me just kind of resounded. I mean, at least for my impression, was a Hegelian understanding of the general economy with historical data. I'm wondering if he goes into that in the next section, almost like a dialectical process of understanding history from a communal standpoint, or a dialectical standpoint, which is what I am curious to read further more on.
Yeah. And I think specifically so he was friends with Khrushchev.
Who's that?
So he's the most important interpreter and advocate of Hegel in France in the 20th century.
It's like you're
And-
not reading any secondary text, Joseph.
Yeah, what Joseph, come on. Yeah.
I think I have him. Was his political essays on Hegel? I
don't know. So his main thing is what's that name of the book?
Oh, this guy.
Structure and
This one?
Genesis?
You can't see it. This
Yeah,
it
it's
is.
him.
That's it. Yeah.
Okay. I missed it. I just
You've
learned how to
got
say
it. I mean,
Bataille's name. Oh, yeah, sorry. No,
It has to come to consciousness. It has to develop historically within consciousness, and then you notice it. Yeah.
okay.
But yeah, so his version of Hegel is really influential, and he emphasizes the historical aspect too, which also I get here, where that's something that I think contemporary scholars kind of question, this overemphasis on the historical in Hegel. But Khrushchev was sort of according to this story at least, is at the genesis of the structure of emphasizing the historical. And I think that's more emphasis right there that he's talking specifically about Hegel. But how he will link these historical forms and self-consciousness, I don't know. Because I have no idea how Hegel did that, because he didn't seem to be talking about history at all. in my opinion. But yeah,
Forgive me, I have to jump off. I have two very rambunctious boys who've been very quiet for me for the last 2 hours. I'm very happy with them and proud of them for that. So I have to run, gentlemen. Appreciate your time, and I will see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel. Or no, Monday. See you Monday.
Take care, Joseph.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
One thing to be said about Kojev though was I think I remember when Kojev like first read some of Bataille's work and like on Ace Fail, or however you say that, he was just like, what is this? He didn't like it at all. It was like, this is crazy, irrational, But also one other thing of it's not in this, but it's another thing he wrote, which from Bataille, which might clarify for some people's thing on Hegel, which is called base materialism and Gnosticism. You can look it up, but it goes over both some of his views on like Marxist dialectical materialism and Hegel, and also the Gnostics.
I think that's in the Visions of Excess, right?
Yeah.
I think I remember seeing it in the index. So as also that the psychological structure of fascism too.
Yeah.
There's a few other ones in there that I wanted to read, but yeah, I want to read the I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it either. Asaphael, the headless. So basically his Dionysian cult. They had a journal that a lot of other really big philosopher, scholar, cultural theorist people. Yeah, it was Klosowski. I think is a really important one. I've mentioned him before. Maybe people don't remember, but he's the one that wrote the really influential book on Nietzsche,
Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle.
Yeah.
I've wanted to read that book, but haven't.
Yeah, it sounds really good. I want to read it too. And that's where Deleuze's reading of Nietzsche, a lot of it comes from that book, and Klosowski kind of in general. But he also was an author who had these really weird, like erotic, violent, Sade-esque novels. One of them called Le Baphomet, which is special to me because I love Baphomet. I worship Baphomet. I'm actually not even joking for this one. Well, I'm not going to get into exactly why and how, but yeah, I worship Baphomet and Dionysus, so it resonates with me a lot.
You know,
Good
Chase,
stuff.
I'm not sure this is true. I think you can get horns grafted onto your skull.
Oh yeah,
like permanent horns.
2022, baby.
Put it on the bingo card. Okay, I think we all have bingo cards. Maybe mine is more pronounced because I'm just a ridiculous person, but we've all got bingo cards. We should actually make them too.
I have no idea what the hell you were talking about.
Oh, you were not paying attention to the chat.
Oh. Apparently.
It's all good. Eric's gonna make me a bingo card.
Yeah. Characteristics of Chase in our conversations. Showing a book, trying to show a page of a book or a book.
Yeah.
And then bringing up Deleuze. Always Deleuze.
Yeah. Deleuze, Bergson, Nietzsche.
Yeah.
Where's
Plotinus?
Oh yeah. Cats was another one. That was actually the one I suggested. Where is it? I can't find it anymore.
Deleuze, Bergson, Boris family member, my life as a TA, putting the text to the camera.
Yeah. I love it. I like making fun of myself, so but usually I like to make fun of myself, but in this case, I still like it. So go for it. I say, let's do Chase bingo card. But then I don't want to be the only person with a bingo card. I will admit that.
We should make fun of Hunter since he's not here.
Oh yeah, you could definitely have a hunter bingo card. Yeah.
The two edges of the spears smashing into each other.
Okay.
A rose is a rose.
Rose
Oh,
and
the rose is the cross of
Cross
the, what is it? Yeah,
rose
yeah.
and the cross of something.
The present.
There you go.
cross of the
I
cross.
still don't know what that means.
Coffee without milk is what I think of.
Oh
Rose-
yeah.
Coffee without cream.
Rosicrucians.
Spirit is a bone.
Yeah. You know what? Spirit is a bone.
Absolutely.
I believe that. I totally believe that. Spirit is a bone.
Okay, he actually defended that, but I don't remember his defense. But anyway, are we done?
It's probably on my YouTube video, so go check it out.
True, good point. Yeah.
You know, I'm sure you've got 6 hours to spend.
Trying to
scrolling
profit
through.
off of
Did
this.
you synchronize it with any music?
Oh, that's a good idea. What is some good, just like hunter lecture music?
Make a montage of Hunter.
Sometimes I want to get something atonal.
Atonal.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not gonna feel the fire because I know a lot of my own idiosyncrasies, so I'm not gonna feel my own bingo card fire. But
Bye, Julie.
I'm glad
Bye.
you're
Bye, everybody.
I'm glad you're all safe
Bye-bye.
from the bad weather. So,
Likewise.
Eric, did you get what I sent you?
I did. I've made my way through a good chunk of it, but still.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I sent you a lot, but I'd rather send you, really what I had on the whole thing instead of, kind of picking and choosing for you. I want to do that. I thought it was better to send you, so. Yeah. Okay. Well, anytime you want to talk about it, yeah, and I wasn't expecting you to be done with it. I mean, I know how serious you are. So what I gave you was a lot.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, once I sit down and start reading, like I get caught in it and I just go and go and go. And it's, so, and with stuff I'm interested in. So I can easily do that. Yeah. So
Well, yeah, anytime you'd like to get together, I mean, even in a Zoom, I mean, let me know.
cool. Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I'll when I've gone through all the material, and then also I need to get some more progress done on my thesis. And then, yeah, get some more headspace.
Sure. And if you're open to it, I'd be happy to read over your thesis drafts.
Sure. Yeah, it's still, goodness, I just like 5 days ago realized that, I needed to do a little bit of deeper drilling on a concept I was going to deploy. And that's kind of like radically altered the whole beginning part of my thesis. Right. So
Okay.
I'm fine. Right. It develops as I go. Which, yeah, as long as I keep pushing, I'll get there. Right. But,
Yeah. I know it's a cliche, but it's not 100-yard dash.
Right.
As long as you think of it as it just is a longer process, you'll be fine.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, the deeper I get into it, the more I enjoy it. In fact, part of the reason why I'm not further along in my thesis is because I put it off for a while, knowing that once I start, it's hard to stop. I don't know. I can get a little obsessive with things sometimes.
Well, you're supposed to on this thing.
Right. That's right.
You're
Yeah.
supposed to know more about your dissertation than anybody else.
Right. Yeah, no, it's been a good solid 2 weeks where it's like I spend hours of the day thinking about Adorno, and I've got negative dialectics open over here and minimum moralia open over here and dialectic of enlightenment open over here. And
Okay.
but yeah, it's a good place to be.
Yeah, excellent. Good.
Cool. Well, have a good weekend.
Okay, you too. You be safe.